all these buttons I have to push and I can't see. There's all these things on my screen. Okay. So thanks everybody for joining us. Before we start kind of talking and going into our presentation, I just wanted to highlight the month of September. When we were looking for a program to do, I'm also an Association of Indiana Museum board member, and serve on the program committee. And I said, I have something perfect for the month of September, because September is International Underground Railroad Month. So since we're focused on the Underground Railroad with our topic, I just thought I would start real quick to let everybody know that in the state of Indiana, we do recognize International Underground Railroad Month. So just to quickly introduce that, it actually started in the state of Maryland in 2019. So over the last 3 years, it's really grown to incorporate multiple states that have historic ties to the Underground Railroad. And it's considered international because now the country of Canada is involved, since many Underground Railroad routes ended up, or many freedom seekers ended up in Canada because of the Underground Railroad. Maryland, though they started it and started working with the National Park Service to get other states involved, they chose the month of September because those were in that same month, both Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman, who had escaped slavery in Maryland, that was the month that they had escaped. So they decided to make it in September. So in 2021, last September, Governor Eric Holcomb proclaimed it Indiana recognizing International Underground Railroad Month. So I just wanted to share that, just in case, as we go through the conversations, if you are in an institution that is thinking about doing something in the future programmatically or exhibition-wise, September is a good month to do something, partly because of the fact that the month is recognized for that history. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I will come back towards the end, and I'm going to hand things off to Hannah.
All right, let me just share my screen here real quick. All right. So can you all see my slides? Excellent. So I am Hannah Gish. I am a museum educator at the Carnegie Center for Art and History, and we are located in New Albany, Indiana. So we are right across the river from Louisville, Kentucky. And we are a branch of the Floyd County Public Library. So that has given us some, a lot of kind of interesting looks into using our building here, because it was actually a Carnegie Library. Our building was built in 1902 and was the first permanent library here in New Albany. So our site is a little bit different than the others that you're going to be hearing about, because it's not our building that has the connection to the Underground Railroad, it's our exhibitions. So those are what have really gotten us into to be a part of the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. So we have two local permanent local history exhibitions that I'm going to be telling you all a little bit about here. So our first one is Ordinary People, Extraordinary Courage, Men and Women of the Underground Railroad. And this exhibition really focuses on the individual people in New Albany that were working to help freedom seekers. Being right across the Ohio River from Kentucky, from a very large market for enslaved people to be bought and sold, New Albany was really kind of seen as a gateway. Indiana was a free state, but there were different laws that were put in place that kept even Black people who were never enslaved were not allowed to settle here. So Indiana in general, but New Albany as well, kind of seen as the gateway to freedom. So I've got just a little bit about our exhibition. So it is actually 15 years old. It opened in 2007. And in this bottom picture here, you see Pam Peters here on the left, and then our former director, Sally Newkirk, on the right. Pam Peters is the local historian who did most all of the research for our Underground Railroad exhibition. And she literally wrote a book about the Underground Railroad in Floyd County. So there's a ton of information that she has been able to find through doing research, and then also getting information from oral histories. So getting a chance to talk to descendants of the people that are highlighted within our Underground Railroad exhibition. Now, being that our exhibition is 15 years old, we did last year start to look at what are some ways that we could maybe do some updating or looking at what our Underground Railroad exhibition could be in the future. So last year we did have a committee that was brought together with a lot of different local historians and activists to look at our Underground Railroad exhibition and see how we could improve it going forward. And we had a panel discussion at an event that we had last year. That's this top picture, where we basically just asked the community and members of that committee what they thought was good about our exhibition and what we could still look to improve on. And I'll talk about one thing that we did kind of as a result of that here in just a moment. But I do have a couple of pictures looking at our exhibition. It is kind of awkward to go through because it like twists and turns, so it's hard to get good pictures in there. But hopefully you can get a little bit of an idea of what it looks like here. So throughout, we've got different primary source documents. So we've got fugitive ads from newspapers there. We've got information about different laws that were put in place. And then there are also different little plaques throughout that have quotes and information about these ordinary people in New Albany that were helping freedom seekers. And in some cases, actually, there are people that were against helping freedom seekers. But it's all about showing who was there helping and then what were some of the obstacles too, because New Albany wasn't perfect. There were a lot of people here that did not think that enslaved people should be freed. So we don't really super shy away from that fact. We look at what was actually going on and use the information that we have from the people that were here at the time to really show that. But like I said, we do use a lot of primary sources here. And this over here in this left picture, you can see that book down at the bottom is the record of the freedom and manumission papers in New Albany. And Pam Peters, who did the research on this exhibition, she's actually been doing more research into those freedom and manumission papers and has been kind of looking to see what else she can find out. So even 15 years after she did all of this research to make the exhibition, she's still looking for more because there's always more out there that you can find. It just takes a lot of digging to find that. So at the end of the exhibition, we have a little theater that you go into, and it has a video portion. So the video that was made for this exhibition is 60 minutes long, and we have it in DVD form. But when you go into that theater, you can sit down at the little screen, the little kiosk that we've got, and you have a couple of options of how you want to go about that video. So we have a 15-minute edit of that video that you can watch, and it's very informative about the Underground Railroad, specifically in New Albany and Floyd County. But if you want to go a little bit deeper into that, it is interactive, and we have it broken down into chapters. So within each of these chapters, you've got a different subject that it's looking into. And when you go to that, you can hear different stories of people that were here in New Albany. So those same people that are highlighted throughout the exhibition, you can hear some different things that they have to say in that video as well. And the video is one way that we do kind of have to make this more accessible to people because our exhibition is full of a lot of text. It can be overwhelming for some people when they go into it. So this video does really help with that, making it more accessible. But also making it more accessible is our family guide. So we have our family guides for each of our exhibitions. This was created by our other museum educator, Tiara Deacon. And so she made this little trifold brochure family guide to make the exhibition more accessible for a younger audience, but really just for anyone. And it breaks things down a little bit an easier language to understand, and it has opportunities for some expression. It has some little activities to keep kids engaged. We put in a little sound button with a steamboat sound, so that has been quite the hit with younger kids here recently. But we've just been trying to find a way to make it so that more people can go into it and not feel so overwhelmed by all of the information that they get. So that is that exhibition. Oh, actually, also one other thing. We've got teacher resources also. So I used to be a social studies teacher for 7 years before I came to the Carnegie Center. And so I have been making some teacher resources for middle and high school students, so that teachers can bring their kids, they can go through the exhibition, and they've got viewing and discussion questions. And then they also have some different activities that they can complete to really interact with the exhibition more. Our other local history exhibition is on a woman named Lucy Higgs Nichols, and she has a different journey in her life. She is a self-emancipator. So she was born enslaved. She was able to, she ran away and escaped and joined up with the Union Army in Tennessee. And she served as a nurse for the Union Army for 3 years during the Civil War. And then she settled in New Albany after the Civil War. So those soldiers that she was fighting with, they were the Indiana 23rd Volunteers from New Albany. And so that's how she ended up here. But we take this story of Lucy and we actually use it to go into schools. So making things more accessible to a younger audience. This is a story that we take to 3rd through 5th grade classes in Southern Indiana and even over into Louisville as well. And we tell Lucy's story. This is the only picture that we have of Lucy. It's the only one. That's it. So we use that picture a lot because it's all we got. But we tell Lucy's story from the very beginning of her life all the way through her enslavement, her time with the Union Army, and then her time here in New Albany afterwards. And then we have the kids work together to make a collaborative accordion book here that you can see over on the bottom right. So they each get a page with an event in Lucy's life, and they get to illustrate it, and then we put it in that book, and then they have that collaborative book as a class that they can show off to other people. So they get to learn about her, and they really like Lucy. They have a lot of fun with it. And then along with that, we do have a family guide as well that Tiara created for this one. So again, just finding ways to get kids more interactive with the exhibition while they are here. And then I did also create some teacher resources for this as well. So our family guides are hard copies that we have here at the museum. And then our teacher resources, we've got linked as PDFs on our website so that they're always available for teachers if they'd like to use those. And that's all I've got for you. So those are, if you're interested in finding out more about us, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram. That is where we are most active. And then we do also have a YouTube page. And on that YouTube page, we do actually have our 15-minute edit of our video from Ordinary People, Extraordinary Courage, if anyone is interested. But that is all that I've got for you all.
Thanks, Hannah. Appreciate it. I was just there a couple weeks ago to see it, and I highly recommend it. So I think it's definitely worth to go see in New Albany. And New Albany as a city has just a very deep Underground Railroad history and such. So, and Hannah did a great job of kind of talking about their connections and how the research came. So I'll come back to that with some of the suggestions I have in my presentation. So now we get to hear from Tiffany, who was able to join us from Gene Stratton Porter in the Northeast corner of the state. So Tiffany, take it away.
All right. Hi, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, perfect. Let me get my screen shared. Okay. Everybody see that okay? All right. So as Joanna mentioned, I am from the Gene Stratton Porter State Historic Site, and I am lucky enough to be talk about a famous Hoosier author and naturalist. But we've always known, and so about the family's history, but we're kind of diving a little bit deeper into it. Our programmer Lauren actually came to us from Pokagon State Park, where they do a lot of Underground Railroad programming there. So we decided to look a little bit deeper into Jean's family history, and how they kind of had their hand involved in things. Of course, Jean was born in 1863, so right in the heart of the Civil War. So her family was very aware what was going on in the world around them. Her parents were Mark and Mary Stratton. He was a Methodist minister, she was a homemaker, and they had a small farm in Wabash County, Indiana, near a little town called LaGros. Very, very little town. Most people just drive right through it, don't even know it was there. Mark was of British descent. His family actually emigrated over from England, and then Mary was of Dutch descent. And they settled in Wabash County. They'd actually met in Ohio, and kind of moved west, as was common for the time, trying to find more land to farm, kind of find the open road a little bit. Mark and Mary eventually settled down, like I said, in Wabash County, where they proceeded to have 12 children. Now, Jean was the youngest of those 12, and she was the youngest by 6 years. So she was very much a surprise to Mark and Mary. But at the same time, she grew up outdoors, always being constantly underfoot. She was kind of just pushed outside. So her love of nature started at a very young age, and she had this beautiful farm to explore and discover. And a lot of that comes through in her writings. She writes a lot of what she experienced in her actual life. In fact, one of the books I want to talk about in a little bit is called Laddie, and it's the closest thing to an autobiography she ever wrote. There's a couple other books where people challenged her writing. It's very floral, it's very happy ending. Everything wraps up in this nice, neat package. But they challenged her writing, and she was writing about a town called Onabasha, which happens to sound a lot like Wabash, and a lot of the people that she encountered in the town of Wabash. So we know a lot of the characters and stories that Jean wrote about were actually taken from her real life experiences. Now, after she grew up in Wabash County, she met and married a gentleman by the name of Charles Dorwin Porter, and moved to Geneva, Indiana. And she lived there in Adams County from they got married in 1887 to about 1912, is when she made the move north to her home here in Rome City. And now when we interpret her life here in Rome City, we interpret from 1912 to kind of present day, while the Limberlost State Historic Sites interprets from birth to about 1912. We cover a lot of the history in our areas and what was going on in the community. So once Jean got into her adult life, the Underground Railroad was gone. It wasn't active, but it was still very much a part of her history. And on the next slide, you can kind of see, okay, so the yellow star that's right here, that's Wabash County. That's where she grew up. And this is actually off the DNR website, as you can see. And it's an interactive map, and I highly recommend you track it down and find it. I don't think I saved the link, but if you just look up Underground Railroad on the DNR website, this map pops up, and they're interactive. So you can see the ones that are have the red outline in them. Those are counties where there's stories or homes. Some of the red dots are homes. And you can see there's a lot. It's kind of scattered all over, but it's more towards the east side of the state. And of course, Wayne County, where Joanna knows a little bit about the history there. But you can see the blue star is Adams County, and then the green one is Noble County, which is where we're located. And so they kind of stuck to the east side. So we know her home in Wabash County was a little bit far from the normal route. But we know her family was involved because she wrote about it. And there's a couple of books that I'm going to reference. The first one is Lady the Limberlost by Jeanette Porter Meehan, which is her daughter, her only child. She was very okay with just having one child after she saw her mom raise 12 children. But in that book, it's called the Lady of the Limberlost, Life and Letters of Jean Stratton Porter. And so in chapter 2 even, she talks about in the Stratton family Bible records, Geneva Grace Stratton was born August 17th, 1863. At this date, the Civil War was at its height. Intelligent people were discussing the president's proclamation of emancipation and the slave question in general. Mark and Mary Stratton were devoutly anti-slavery and absolute unionists. They often harbored runaway slaves on their farm. There was a ravine running along the edge of the orchard, ending in a hollow which Father Stratton dug out and made into a cave or tunnel. The opening of the cave was heaped with stones, and the place was used as, quote, an underground station. During the night, escaped slaves were brought to the farm and hidden in the cave, where they were given beds of straw, a candle for light, and kept until the next night, when they were again picked up and on their way. And that's all there is. That's all that that's as much as they touch on it in the family, in the biography, or yeah, the biography from Jeanette. But there is, last winter I was doing some kind of cleanup stuff, putting stuff away and reorganizing, and we were looking for some blueprints, I believe is what I was on the hunt for. And I came across an old mailing tube, was kind of beat up, kind of mashed. And it said Ada Wilson on it. And I, immediately made the connection because that was one of Jean's sisters. And so we very carefully pulled this tube out and discover this map. Now this is this is like 4 8.5 by 11 pieces of paper taped together. So this is zoomed in quite a bit. But this is the Stratton family farm. This is where Jean grew up, as told to a friend of Ada Wilson's. This is all drawn out from memory. There's a letter that accompanies it, talks about how the property is laid up. But in this, it mentions the ditch. And so there we've got the LeGros Creek that runs through here, through the fields. And this is kind of where the house sits. So the next slide, get it to move here. It's a little bit closer up, and I apologize. This is this is a little kind of a weird map. But she talks about the creek, which is just up here. I keep using my wrong screen with my mouse. But we figure, because she mentions in the book Laddie about where they think maybe the cave may be. And I'm going to read a brief description, outtake, I guess, blurb from the book, where she is the main character, little sister, which is Jean. She wrote that based off of herself and her experiences, and Leon, which was which is the name of one of her older brothers in the book. So it says, there's somewhere on our land that people can be hidden for a long time. I can remember well enough before the war, ever so long, and while it was going worse, we would find the wagon covered with mud, more mud in the morning than it had been on it at night, and the horses would be splashed and tired. Once I was awake in the night and heard voices. It made me want to drink, so I went downstairs for it and ran right into the biggest black man who ever grew. If father and mother hadn't been there, I'd have been scared into fits. Next morning he was gone, and there wasn't a whisper. Father said I'd had bad dreams. That night the horses made another mysterious trip. Now where did they keep that black man all day? What did they have the black man for? They were helping him run away from slavery to be free in Canada. It was all right. I'd have done the same thing. They helped a lot. Father was a friend of the governor. There were letters from him, and there was some good reason why father stayed at home when he was crazy about the war. I think this farm was what they called an underground station. What I want to know is where the station was. So Leon and little sister continue to go on and hunt for this underground station. But from the readings, we can figure out that it may have been right in this area. So almost right out the back door. We've got the spring house here, the chicken feeding lot, and that this would have been the couple of back doors into the house. So there was access, easy access in and out of the house. So that's kind of how the site got involved in telling this part of Indiana's history. And having Joanna as a great reference, we've been able to kind of talk to her and figure out some of the details. And then Lauren, who I mentioned is our program developer, has some history working in Steuben County. And so they talk about Sojourner Truth and her experience in Angola. And there's another house up there that they talk about. And in fact, earlier this summer, they had a descendant of the house that's up in Steuben County. His great, I think, grandson was there at one of the hikes they did. So the family is still very involved in some of the stuff that's happening up in Steuben County. And if you get a chance, if you're ever up this way, there is a statue of Sojourner in Angola now that people can go see. And it talks a little bit of her history in Angola and her experience there. So a little bit about what we do here as part of our program. You can see Lauren, it's kind of a darker picture there on the left. But this was our first Underground Railroad hike, where this is our second year doing it. And what we do is we start out at the Carriage House, which is our visitor center, and we take people for a hike through the woods. We try to keep them moving very quickly. We encourage them to leave flashlights back at the house, but we understand some people may not be comfortable with that, which is totally fine. But Lauren stops along the way and talks about different things that the freedom seekers would have experienced, how they would have used the land in different ways, and how they would have used the sky to guide them. So it's a really kind of immersive hike. And then we come back to the Carriage House, and Lauren does a presentation on slavery then to kind of now. it's a little dark. It does, I mean, it's a dark time in our history, but it gives people an idea what what the freedom seekers experienced. And we are actually, for the first time, doing a partner program, which I'm excited to see how this goes, with the Limberlost State Historic Site tomorrow night, down in Geneva. And we are doing kind of same concept, but we're talking about the swamp and how the swamp was really utilized for the freedom seekers as they traveled, because believe it or not, there was a lot of resources there. And Kurt, which is the naturalist down there, is going to lead the hike. And then Lauren and myself are going to do a presentation on kind of the whole process, how things went and the history of the Underground Railroad. And then we have our hike, our first hike of the season at our site is on October 1st. And then we have another one November 5th, which if you get a chance, I encourage you to come and enjoy and listen about the history in our area, because that's what Lauren focuses on. She talks about the whole system, but we focus a little bit on the history in our area. There's an Underground Railroad station, a believed Underground Railroad station on State Road 3 North, just outside of Kendallville, and then the connection to the northern counties. So we're working on, and with Joanna's help, we're working on creating that full kind of figuring out the highway, if you will, the main rail line. There we go, for the way the freedom seekers would travel through Indiana. So I'm excited to be part of this and to create this experience for people to see what it was like, and to see our history that isn't always talked about a whole lot. And we did get some pushback when we started doing this, but now that people are seeing the connection between us and the other sites, I'm excited to see where this will go. So thank you for coming. I appreciate it. And I'm sorry it was late. We had some visitors pop in on us, and well, you know how it goes.
Visitors come first. That's
right.
completely
Visitor centric.
understood.
That's absolutely
You
right.
weren't sitting by the lake on this beautiful fall day.
I was tempted. I was tempted. Although the 35 degrees made it a little easier to stay inside this morning.
Okay. Well, so one of the goals of this presentation was to kind of show a couple different sides to particular stories and ways that they can be interpreted. So what I love about bringing in the Carnegie Center at New Albany, they did an exhibition. It's very locally based. They're right at the gateway of a crossing point between Louisville and New Albany, one of the major crossing areas for freedom seekers. Then you go all the way up to where Tiffany is in the northeast corner of the state. And she is at a site where you probably wouldn't expect to hear an Underground Railroad story. But yet what's interesting about where she's located is they're sort of in the gateway out of Indiana into Michigan and then eventually to Canada. And so they're using programming as a way to highlight some local stories. So what I'm going to do is kind of help provide some potential resources you may use if you're thinking, could our institution be interpreting stories? I know exhibition is a very involved process because you have a very specific way you have to tell a story. It has to be very graphic. Carnegie has a great mix between bringing in like newspaper resources and those primary resources. But what if you don't have that? What if, so sometimes a program can be a better option in telling these stories if you can find a really great way to do it. And Gene Stratton Porter and Limberlost, which are sites that are sort of more nature-based. They're historic houses, but they have a lot of nature, natural history interpretation happening. They're able to take programming and make it fit in within the model of the type of programs that they're doing, and still being able to give people a sense of sort of a different feeling for freedom seekers of being out in nature, being there at night. At Limberlost, because of the swamp, they're going to be focusing on stories of freedom seekers' survival, how they would, what would crossing the swamp be like? Because where I'm at in Wayne County, if they crossed into New Albany and then they came up to Wayne County and then eventually up where Tiffany is, they got to get across the swamp to get there. So what is that like? And so it's kind of neat how we're able to tell those stories. So I'm going to share my screen again here. Give me another moment. Going back and forth from sharing screens. And then, all right. So going into talking a little bit about some resources and some opportunities, in case you're not familiar, I'm at the Levi and Catherine Coffin State Historic Site. We're in Wayne County, Indiana, right on US 27, just 10 minutes north of Richmond. And Wayne County has a very deep history with the Underground Railroad. And partly because of the Quakers that settled here in Wayne County, and north of us, Wayne County, and east of us in Henry County, it was a large area where Quakers settled. And normally when you study Underground Railroad history, oftentimes where you see a presence of Quakers, you see stories of the Underground Railroad, or you hear about houses connected to the Underground Railroad. Well, in Indiana, the most prominent that we have is the Coffin Home. So here is a picture of the 1839 house where Levi and Catherine Coffin lived. So here at the State Historic Site, we focus on interpretive guided tours through the house, really focusing on stories of the Coffins, both their reasonings of being involved in the Underground Railroad, talking about how the house was used based off evidence that we have, as well as highlighting stories of some of the freedom seekers that they helped. So, and these are pictures of Levi and Catherine, in case you're unaware of what they look like. But really, we are one of the best provenance Underground Railroad locations in the country, and we're very, very fortunate to have it here in Indiana. And we're very, very fortunate that we have a lot of stories that we can tell because we have a fantastic primary resource with Levi Coffin's autobiography. But one of the tough things about interpreting the Underground Railroad is trying to find evidence and trying to find stories of activities that were considered illegal. And so people tended not to keep records of what they were doing. I mean, there are a few exceptions, but that tended not to be the normal practice. So how do you make sure, even if you're researching stories, how can you tell fact from fiction? Because that is an issue as well. So if you're thinking going forward of perhaps looking into interpreting stories in some type of format, depending on what direction you go, here are some things to think about getting started. So obviously, I encourage you to find, local stories if you can, whether that's local stories that happened within the community where your institution is, whether it's local stories to the county, trying to find what is documented and what is documented, again, fact versus fiction. Sometimes people embellish a little bit with these stories. I have it with the Coffins that I find resources that embellish some things that they either claim the Coffins were involved in or things that happened to the Coffins, but we have no evidence of it. So, obviously looking at local library resources, especially if they have an archivist, that's a great place to start. If you have a county historical society or museum, sometimes they are great resources. A county historian might be tied to those institutions, or every county in Indiana should have a historian. Connecting with them is also a great opportunity. There's a story in Jay County of a cabin being connected to the Underground Railroad. I have not been able to find any provenance to this. It's called the Sullivan Cabin. And so I emailed the county historian and said, what do you know? What can you tell me? Still, they claim they're looking into it, but I still haven't gotten anything back. So I'm not sure if we're going to find anything there. So it happens. There are a lot of historical markers across the state of Indiana. Some of your institution may have one, a historical marker, but there are historical markers that tie particular locations and stories. So you might see if there's one in your county. The map that Tiffany showed you earlier through the DNR, and Katie linked it in the chat, that actually came through the DHPA arm of DNR. And Division for Historic Preservation Archaeology has done a good job of sharing some stories. That map's actually interactive, so you can click on the county and it'll take you to some stories. So you can look and see if there's not necessarily something for every county, but there are some there for particular counties. And then, are there any county histories in the area where you are? Wayne County has like 3 county histories. Look at your county history, see if they talk about anybody being anti-slavery supporters. Sometimes they may say this person supposedly was helping freedom seekers, and you might just have a sentence with a mention that is a name that may be just tied to a location, and that might be as far as you get. Like I said, some of these things were not being documented thoroughly, and so all of this is research that's happening, decades to over 100 years later. So you have to kind of look and see what that says and determine, can I do something with this? Another resource that I sometimes turn to, since I'm so close to the Ohio border, I get a lot of people from Indiana and Ohio asking questions. And a couple decades after the end of the Civil War, towards the latter part of the 1800s, there was a guy at Ohio State University named Wilbert Siebert who started to try to do really kind of the first research on the Underground Railroad. And he was really focused on the state of Ohio. But with his research and with the evidence he was getting back from people that he was connecting with, he was getting a lot for Indiana as well. So if you go to the Ohio History Connection website, you can just Google William Siebert Collection. It'll take you right here to this website. All of his research is digitized. He actually did end up writing a book, A History on the Underground Railroad. So that is available online as well through Google Books. But if you want to search through the actual resources yourself, because it's all digitized, you can search by keyword. So if you happen to have a name of a person, you can search by county. You can search by town name. Any keyword that you can think of, you can search. Now, again, I'm not making promises. It may turn something up, but it can be helpful. So here I did a search on Levi Coffin, where there's tens of pages of things on Levi Coffin in his research, because tons of people were writing about Coffin's time in Indiana and Coffin's time in Cincinnati. But you might come across something that may lead you in another direction of research. So I encourage you to look at his papers as well. And then one of the things I also encourage you to do is to make it as inclusive of a story as possible. Because in this period, in the decades before the Civil War, it was not just white individuals that were involved in this. We had a large number of free Blacks living in the state of Indiana that also themselves were supporting in some way. Now, again, their history is even harder sometimes to research in those decades before the Civil War, as they were even less likely to keep a lot of records of their history of their families and such. But one of the things that many Underground Railroad historians have been trying to do is trying to look at other forms of organization in the hopes that it may turn up something to show Underground Railroad support. So first and foremost, try to recognize in the general area of your institution, was there a free Black settlement? If you're in a city like, if you're in like Madison, Indiana, I'll talk about this in a moment, they had the neighborhood of Georgetown, then you could look at those histories, try to identify who the individuals were that lived there. What were the Black churches? Black churches are a huge part into a lot of the organizational support that free Blacks supported, not just with Underground Railroad, but with getting, voting rights and civil rights in general, really pushing during the Civil War to get Blacks to be able to serve in the Union Army and such. So Black churches are really instrumental ways for these communities to organize and to create some political pressure and those kinds of things. And so we do have a lot of research going into how much the churches could have been supporting the Underground Railroad. So that could also lead into other Black organizations. There were Blacks who belonged to Masons and such like that. So there could be something there. And then of course, Black businesses, especially in urban areas like Indianapolis. New Albany was the largest city in Indiana in 1850, which is something I learned when I went to the Carnegie exhibit. I had no idea that it was the largest city at that time. So what kind of prominent business people were there? What kind of political activities were they supporting? That could potentially reach into other venues of, I call it the rabbit hole of research. You find something and you want to stop what you're doing and start researching that. And so that could happen here. So just make sure that if you can, to try to tell as inclusive of the story as possible. So just to give some examples of some programs, again, just to maybe provide some inspiration of what could a program look like, if again, or an exhibition look like. I mentioned the Georgetown neighborhood in Madison, Indiana. I think if you go to the Madison, Indiana Tourism Office, which is located next door to the Lanier State Historic Site, I believe that's where you can get copies of the Georgetown neighborhood walking tour. And so then you can take it into the neighborhood, you can walk around, and you'll be introduced to, the local Black church that was instrumental to that neighborhood organizing, who were some of the prominent individuals like Elijah Anderson and George Day Baptiste that lived there that we know were supporters. Where did they live? Those kinds of things. And then tells you a few other stories. And then here in Fountain City at our site, we developed what we call the historic Newport tour, which, excuse me, Newport was a historic name for Fountain City when the Coffins lived here. And so what we've done is we're expanding our interpretive stories outside of the Coffin home to really include the community as a whole. And so we spend about an hour basically walking up and down US 27, telling other stories that we know of, pointing out to other houses of other supporters that worked alongside the Coffins, and just kind of telling a little bit of a bigger story than just the one house here in town. You may look at some virtual options. Sometimes, depending on the type of story or your capacity, maybe you don't have the capacity and the staff to do something in person, but you could develop something virtual. If you're familiar with Discover Indiana, which is through the IUPUI Public History Program, a couple years ago, I developed a virtual tour themed around the escape of Eliza Harris, who had escaped out of Boone County, Kentucky, and escaped through Ohio and Indiana, and eventually made it through the Coffin home and then eventually into Canada. So the goal of that tour was just to identify particular locations where supposedly Eliza had passed through in her escape, talk about the evidence and sometimes lack of evidence. When I told you about that cabin in Jay County, that's one of the locations that claims that Eliza came through there. So, it's just kind of, it's interactive. And so it's actually something where if you wanted to drive this tour, you can do that. We give you the addresses and the directions and all that. So you can just do it virtually online and see a map and just go from stop to stop that way. And then of the few exhibitions that I'm aware of, besides the one at the Carnegie that Hannah spoke at here at the Coffin site, we do have a self-guided exhibition called Soul Seeking Safety. So again, it is trying to put the Coffin story into a larger context of the history of the time, discussing things that were happening statewide in relation to slavery here in Indiana, but also what was happening around the country as well. And then, you know, I have people that just plan bus tours. There are just so many locations, and people are really into Underground Railroad history. So I'm just throwing that out as an idea, not saying it's the best idea, but I actually have bus tour companies. Tiffany's laughing. Sometimes I don't know if it's the best idea or not, but bus tours or companies are always planning, or travel companies are always planning these themed tours, and that's a very popular one in the Midwest, because they can go to Kentucky, to Ohio, to Indiana, to Michigan, even Canada if they wanted to go into Canada. So just putting that out there as an idea. But looking at more of some, just to wrap up, some national programs. If you notice on one of my slides, on the slide that Hannah gave, both of our locations are part of what's called the Network to Freedom. It's actually a National Park Services program. It doesn't make us national park sites, but we're an affiliate of that program because we interpret stories of slavery in the Underground Railroad, stories of slavery and freedom. And so if you go to the National Park Service or just Google Network to Freedom, it's just a great resource to kind of see what other sites out there exist. You'd be able to go and research and see what kind of programs that they're doing, what's the experience like at their site. They actually have a passport program. So we have a stamp that people can get at our site, specific if they come here, that's from the National Park Service. So anyways, and they help to actually advertise our programs, which is nice as well. So it helps to tell people nationally what's happening at our site, which is great. The Atkins Arboretum, I've really been following their progress. They are on the eastern shore of Maryland. That is the area where Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman were both enslaved. They specifically are in the almost exact geographic area where Harriet Tubman was enslaved. Kind of like Gene Stratton Porter, where it's this site that's an arboretum, it's more focused on you know, the environment and teaching environment and local environment and such. But recognizing, hey, but this was an environment that Harriet Tubman and other individuals were enslaved. They felt it was important to start telling those stories of how their enslavement and their connections to the environment intertwined. And so they have been doing videos, they've been doing they have like an interactive section to their website and such. So even if you can't go to Atkins, you can still kind of experience it. And again, it's kind of talking about how how slaves use their own agency to really understand the environment around them, to sometimes support themselves in ways when their enslavement is not supporting them through food subsistence and those kinds of things. Boone County Public Library in Kentucky also has been doing a great job. They've got a great archive that they're really starting to open up and making it more accessible to the public, and really trying to interpret stories through their archive, through certain parts of their collection, creating story maps and stuff. And so I'm always following what they're doing. I'm kind of jealous of what some of their virtual options are, because I think we can do that here in Indiana. And of course, there's the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center in Ohio, Cincinnati, Ohio. And then my last one is Thomas Jefferson's home, Monticello. On the exhibition side of things, they wanted, if you're familiar with Sally Hemings, she was an enslaved woman that Thomas Jefferson had a relationship with, who he owned, had children with her. Monticello had discovered, when renovating some bathrooms, a part of Monticello where Sally Hemings and her family would have lived as slaves, and decided we have to be able to tell Sally's story, that her story is very integral to the history of Monticello. And so I encourage you to go online and see kind of what that experience is like, because they're having to tell a story in a space with really no artifacts. You know, we don't have images of what Sally Hemings looked like. We don't know what her children look like, those kinds of things. So how do you tell those stories when you don't necessarily have objects, but you have sort of a representation of space? So I encourage you to take a look at that too, and that might inspire you or give you an idea there. So hopefully that helps again and give you a sense of maybe some directions to go in, but we'll open it up to questions now, Katie, if folks have them.
Yeah, feel free to hop off mute if you have a question, or feel free to also put it in chat and I'll read it for you. But I myself have a couple questions. Hannah, when you gathered your committee to help reimagine your exhibit, how did you get those people together? Were they people you were already working with? Did you put out a call? How did you do that?
So that was done by our previous education lead, Julie Leidner. So she had been kind of in contact with different artists and activists in the area, and historians, and so she had some connections there, and so she used those connections to get those people there. But then also with having Pam Peters, a local historian, she had some people there, and just 2 blocks away from us is the Second Baptist Church. And so the reverends there, they were involved in this and a part of that as well. So we just we looked at people that were local. We did have someone from IU Bloomington come down, but we looked mainly at local people who, it's telling the story of this community, and it's our community now. So we wanted to look at local ideas and what local people had to say.
Great, thank you. I know sometimes identifying people is very difficult when you're trying to bring in new voice. And so like you guys, I agree, looking outside of your organization and leveraging those who are already in the community will definitely help fill that story that you're hoping to do. So thank you. Hey, Tiffany, question about your walk. Now, when you guys were developing the program, did you have a target audience in mind? And now that you've done a couple walks, are you seeing that audience? Or are you seeing a different type of audience?
So we targeted it, especially since some of the stuff that is covered, it's a little, Lauren talks about how they came to America. And that was definitely not a pleasant experience. So we gear it, I think our age limit is 10 and up. Okay. Because by then they should have at least touched on it in school at some point in time. So they're somewhat familiar with it. And we do let people know, like if they're calling to ask about, there is some walking in the woods. So if you're not very stable on your feet, or you might not be sure, we let them know ahead of time. So I would say 10 and older, but we've had a lot of, there's been a couple of families. I know Joanna came to one and brought her kids with her. And then we had another couple of families actually on different hikes. And then the few people that have registered for the one in Geneva are families. So I mean, that's kind of what we're seeing is families. They're getting out and getting a hike and learning about this part of our history. But we do try to make sure that it's old 10 and older. I mean, just because, you know, they've already talked about it and they've learned about it. So, but we're noticing it's mostly families, honestly. A few couples and things, but mostly families in the last couple of hikes we've done.
Great. Yeah, because I would have thought, developing it, that it would have been adults. And it's good to hear that the kids are coming as well,
Yeah.
because, you're right. They've heard it in school and now they're experiencing it.
That's exactly
And
it.
so that's a great time.
Mhm.
So Joanna, question for you. When you were doing, when you were talking about getting the rest of the community involved in like going up and down the highway at different stops, did you reach out to the peoples and ask them, hey, we might have a group of people stop in front of your home? Or so just curious, or are
Well,
you?
Yeah. With our walking tour locally, I basically tell my staff, stick to the sidewalk.
Okay.
So, there are a few homeowners that know that we're doing the tour. It doesn't seem to have been a problem there, as long as we're staying on the sidewalks, and, we try not to stay too long. We're not going to hang out a half hour in front of someone's house and kind of loiter. But haven't had any negative feedback, let's put it that way. Visitors have enjoyed it. And like I said, and that's the other thing too with tours. If you're walking through neighborhoods, you do have to be like most homes that, unlike ours, that have underground railroad ties are still private homes and people live in them. So you do have to respect the fact that this is private property. And so yeah, I think people realize who we are and what we're doing and respect the site and the story that we're telling. In the Georgetown neighborhood, when I talked about in Madison, it's a very urban, historic, but urban neighborhood. Again, sticking to the sidewalks, that kind of stuff. But yeah.
Great, thank you.
If it's a bus tour, I would recommend not focusing on private homes if you can at all help it. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
do something more like museums or historic sites or something where they're used to the public being around.
Laura, I see you unmuted. Do you have a question?
Hi, I do actually. And thank you for everyone's presentations. It was really great to hear about all your sites. And I was thinking, as Joanna was showing her slide with walking tours and other kinds of tours. And here at the Carnegie Center, we haven't had anyone come by on this probably in several years, but in the past, we have had people come by as part of an Underground Railroad bicycling tour. And I did just do a quick Google search, and there's a website called Adventure Cycling, and they have an Underground Railroad tour. So I was curious for Joanna and Tiffany and anyone else, have you all had people come to your sites as part of that?
Not with an official group. We're kind of near the Cardinal Greenway. I have to think what it's called. We're still like 10 miles away, but bikers will divert and they'll bike here and then bike to the trail. But someone had made me aware of that a year or two ago. He's a bicyclist and says, you should plan something. I'm like, yeah, that's really intense for me. But they're there and I'm aware of them. And I think it's a good idea. That's just how some people prefer to experience places. They just love to do it on their bike.
Yeah.
So we're a little bit closer to our trail system up here. It's called the Noble Trail. It's called the Fishing Line Trail, the one that runs right by the site. We're actually considered a trailhead. So we have yet to have someone up here. But I mean, we are on the way to Steuben County. So I would maybe eventually, as far as having that happen. But no, I mean, we see a lot of cyclists, but none of them have ever been a part of that. I've kept my ear open because I think it was Kisha that told us about the bike trail.
Yeah,
and so
right. That's right.
I've been keeping my ear open, but I haven't heard anything yet of bikers coming through our area.
I need to look more into it, but I think sometimes with those bike tours, you camp along the way.
Yeah.
Because if it's a multi-day thing,
yeah,
or you got to plan somewhere to see. So that's why it's like, it's kind of intensive to think of planning one of those. But, you could do it. You could do it from New Albany, Madison, and come north up this side or go up through. I mean, we've got so many bike trails anymore. It's kind of easy. I would think it would be easy, but the thought.
Yeah.
Collaborative programs are great.
Absolutely. All right. Well, yes, thank you all. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Yeah, if there are any more, Laura, thank you for your question. Oh, Carrie's got, and Tanya. Carrie, go ahead.
Question for Tiffany. Tiffany mentioned that the night hikes had initial pushback. Was that from the community?
That was not from the community. It was more, is it focused? Is this in your program area? And so that's when we kind of dove in a little deeper. And Lauren was like, well, no, there's history north of us, there's history south of us. So, and there's the gene connection. So there was a little bit of pushback from the higher ups in the museum as to whether or not it should be something that we cover. But once we found the documentation and the notes and talked about the history around us, they were a little bit more open to it. And 2 of the 3 we had last year were sellouts. So that did help us get it on the calendar again this year. So we'll be interested to see how this program develops in the future.
And a follow-up. Are there plans for the documents that you found?
Yes, I was talking to Catherine Gould, who just left the museum a couple of months ago, about getting them digitized, coming down and getting them digitized and scanned in, and probably get reproductions made so we can get these put away. But I have transcribed the letter, and Ada talks about different things that she experienced and the way things grew on the farm. So having that and the connection in Laddie and the notes from Life and Letters, I mean, that really gives us a good picture as to where things and how things were set up on the farm. So keep your eyes open. Something's coming.
Thank you, Carrie. Tiffany. Tanya, your question?
Oh, yes. So first of all, thank you for the presentations. I wish I had actually been to all of your sites, but I've only been to the Levi Coffin site. And the thought that I was having, because, I'm naturally drawn to this kind of programming, but I know not everybody is. And so maybe because ICOM just released its new museum definition, which I feel is very aspirational. I'm curious what it is on a sort of 30,000 feet above the ground kind of level, what it is you think your programs do to solve societal problems or address certain issues that really help people live their lives better.
I'll take a stab. One of the things that kind of slightly interpreted a little bit in our exhibit is the fact that when the 13th Amendment passed, people have this assumption that slavery ended, civil rights began, we're a happy nation, let's move forward. When that's not the case. So one of our programmatic goals, because it's really, I don't have a lot of space in the exhibit, but one of the programmatic goals is to continue highlighting the fight for civil rights and where we can, showing the through line between like the activism and the work of people like the Coffins and abolitionists to people like Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders at that time. So it's, for us, we're, again, it goes with our site and what we do, but it's easy for us to highlight those things and to be able to do those type of programs as well. So hopefully people will realize, like I said, there's a through line between this history and even today. So I encourage, being a location for public conversations, those kinds of things, those type of programs, being an open forum for those type of programs for your communities, I think would be really important. Hopefully that helps, Tanya, with your question.
It does.
So
I've been to your site. I definitely see the through line that you're doing. And one of the sort of values that comes through is how brave the Coffins were to do something outside of the norm in their community. And so the flip side is, for an audience member, what would you do?
Yeah, well, sometimes I like to ask the question, the Coffins had no problem with breaking the law. They had religious reasons and moral reasons why they did that. And especially when I do school group visits, I say, well, when we look back, we see we see them almost as heroes, right? That they did the right thing, but their contemporaries did not like what they were doing and would not have agreed with them breaking the law. So then I kind of posed the question, I said, then you're going to be voters, you're going to be full-fledged citizens of our country. it is kind of a what would you do situation if you find something that's not right, if you know, so I try not to bring up specific topics. I mean, abortion would be like the perfect one to talk about right now, and sort of the reactiveness with the Dobbs decision and those kinds of things. But I just at least want to plant that seed in their minds of, at some point, you have an opportunity and you have a voice, and it's really up to how you use that voice that's going to be important. So hopefully that seed is planted.
And to piggyback off that a little bit, one of the things that Lauren does, especially at our November one last year, as it goes into the season of gift giving, be conscious, be aware of where you're buying from and the companies that you're buying from. So that's something that Lauren covers, is to make, you know, while this says fair trade, is it really, what does it take to get this certification? So it's really kind of again puts it back on them, like, here is what happened and here is what continues to happen. What can you do to affect change in your everyday life? And so it's kind of, you know, we talk about this everything and kind of wrap it up with that. We leave them with that, almost like, okay, here's what our history says. What can we do to change it? What can we do to change things moving forward? So we do present that to them at the end of our hikes and stuff.
Yeah, and we do similar things here. So, I mean, our exhibition is titled Ordinary People, Extraordinary Courage. So it's really focused on just average everyday people. I mean, most of the people that are highlighted in our exhibition, no one else in the country knows about them. They were just average citizens here in New Albany, but they did have that courage to help out. So, you know, we do in our family guide, we do kind of ask, you know, we have a take action bit. So it's asking the kids or whoever picks up this family guide, what are ways that you can continue to help your community today? So we really do focus on what can we still do today as ordinary people.
Thank you. Lily just put a message here in the chat, and at the end she asked a question. How have each of your institutions integrated social media outreach for these programs and or utilizing the platform to share stories talked about in these exhibitions that people cannot see in person?
I've been trying to share more stories through social media, especially of freedom seekers. We're very very lucky. I hate to use that word sometimes. I feel like a better word it should be there, but it's just not coming to mind. It's Friday. You know, to have all these stories of the coffins, but also to have stories of the freedom seekers they helped. And as much as our interpretation is surrounded around the coffins because it's their home and it's how they chose to use it, it is important to understand the risks and the decisions that these freedom seekers were making to get that far, let alone to keep going, what keeps them going, those kinds of things. So trying to highlight more of those stories, and also to highlight stories of freedom seekers that stayed and didn't go to Canada. You know, the way we teach the Underground Railroad, it's like, well, everybody went north. Well, that's not necessarily true now. Research is showing people went south as well, but also helping them understand that even if you made it to a free state, does not mean you are a welcomed individual either. And so just trying to keep stories and that content in front of people's eyes to remind them that we like to think that Indiana was this great place because we were a free state. Free didn't really mean free for all at that time. So bringing those stories out, and sometimes social media allows us to do
that. Thank you. Joanna, I almost said Levi Coffin. I looked at your name.
I know, sorry.
I was like, I did not process that. So yeah, Lily, please hop on if you can. But it looks like what she's talking about is she's and actively gaining exposures to these stories through the use of social media, like you're saying, focusing on those what's happening at your site, as well as sharing those personal stories. And she's trying to figure out how to filter out the more fluffy stories and get to the meat of them. That we're exposed to a lot of information, and not everything's always the most accurate through those platforms.
I think sometimes social media offers me or our site an opportunity to tell the stories that we would love to be able to tell on our tours, but there's never time, you know. I can talk to people for 2.5 hours and I can really expand on a lot of these concepts, but people have lives and we got to keep things going. So yeah, so sort of getting through that fluff, which she's saying, I think social media can offer an opportunity. And I think sometimes like virtual opportunities through your website, like I talked, like story maps, those kinds of things, may allow you to, and that's another reason with the walking tour why I designed it, is the Coffins were not the only ones in this community doing this. There were white and people of color doing it. And thankfully, working together made this town so successful at what it did. But I just feel like Coffins deserve a lot of credit that there were others doing this as well. And we need to make their voices known as well.
Thank you. Lily, do you feel give me a thumbs up if you felt like we got your question answered? Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. Any other questions before we close up? This has been an amazing conversation. I really appreciate not only our speakers as well as those who joined us today and had such great questions and ideas to share, because that's what Aim to Connect really meant to do, is to bring people from all corners of the state together to have conversations about the great things happening in our community and inspire new ideas. If you're able to join us next time for our October 27th, again at noon, we're going to have two speakers. They're going to talk about building alliances, community partnerships, and exhibits and content development. So they're going to talk about how they reached out to their communities to bring in different viewpoints as well. And we'll have speakers from the Indiana Historical Society and the Indiana State Museum and Historic Sites again. So before I close up, just want to say, look in your email box here shortly. I will send you a survey. Tell us how we did. And if you got future ideas for programs, we'd love to hear them. So if no other questions, I did put the Tiffany's, Joanna, and Hannah's emails in the chat. So feel free to grab those. They're here to help you as well. And you can always reach out to AIM. We're here as well. So have a lovely weekend all. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, thank you.
Well.